So with my case in place, I was able to then make a full template for the top. This is basically 3-inch strips of cordboard that I cut down and made a really accurate template for the top so it will fit flush against the walls. So the top, the outside frame is made of 3-inch wide pieces of poplar, so I'm just ripping down that poplar now. And then I made this all piece by piece because at this point those top angles are all slightly different. So you can see I have a straight piece on that inner edge, and then I went through and marked for the angles and adjusted my miter gauge for each piece. They were a little bit different each one. You can see I'm just walking around that inner portion of the frame, making those cuts using a bevel gauge, and then I could take the mark from the bevel gauge and transfer it to the miter gauge and make those cuts. So you can see I'm using that outer piece there to mark, and like I said, this was the process for the inner and the outer frame, walking around and making those cuts, checking the fit, and then making minor adjustments, because with this one, unlike the base, it was super important to build it right on top of the template and make sure that the pieces were flush with the outside edge of the template, because the template fit perfectly in the space. So the tolerances on this top part are much tighter than the base. And then here is that inner frame. So the way I'm going to be constructing this is very similar to how I make face frames for cabinets, and my joint of choice is going to be lap joints. If you prefer using pocket hole screws and have a nice pocket hole setup, pocket holes would work perfectly for this sort of application as well. I just prefer lap joints. I feel like they're almost indestructible, especially for something you're going to be sitting on. So I walked around the inner portion of that frame, and this got very difficult because I just didn't have a big enough space for this in my shop, and I just added some glue to those butt joints and then put some brads in place. I use brads because you could saw through those without damaging the carbide tips on your saw. So this will temporarily hold everything in place overnight, and then I could go through and have a rigid guide to work off of. And once again, you could see I'm really making sure to keep this lined up with my template. So the next day I could start adding the laps, and the verticals in this piece I'm making 4 inches, and that's because where I had to shim out that portion of my carcasses on the bottom is pretty thick. So in order to have enough coverage, I went with 4 inches on those. So this is pretty easy. I'm just making ripped down 4-inch pieces of poplar and gave myself a little bit of extra space, and I'm just ripping those down on my radial arm saw. So then once I had all those verticals, I'm going to be curve cutting those on the radial arm saw. So you can see I'm setting up a stop that's exactly 4 inches wide, and then I'm cutting about halfway through all of my pieces. Once I have that set, I could cut all of them with that stop. You could see it's cutting the perfect width, a bunch of curves, and I could flip it around and cut the other curves. Now I'm attaching the 2 edges first, and then I'm going to let those set up for a little bit. So then with those 2 edges attached, I'll have a really super frame to work with. And then you could see that it's easy to clean up all those curve cuts with a chisel, and you have a nice flat bottom. And then I will use this as a marker to reference on top of the frame in order to cut the laps in the frame I already have. So you could see that that is in place, once again lined up with the template, and I could mark and cut. So working outside was kind of my only option with this piece because it was so big. You could see I'm using the thickness that I had cut on the radial arm saw in order to raise my circular saw and to get the exact depth I needed. I didn't make exact measurements, I just cut it on the radial arm saw and then marked it to get the depth for the circular saw, and then once again it's going through and making a series of curves with that circular saw, and then I could clean up the material and then permanently attach those 2 sides. Working on the ground like this is not ideal. I'm practically in the street, but like I said, I really didn't have a spot to work on this because it did fit on my table saw, but I needed the table saw to make cuts. So then adding a liberal amount of glue on all of these pieces, and then you'll have a nice shoulder. Lap joints are just one of the strongest joints that you can make. Since this will be painted, you don't have to worry about seams or anything like that. And then 2 clamps on each side I did for all of these pieces, and that held it in place. This is Titebond 3 that I use on most of my projects, so within an hour or so it was set up enough to take those clamps off. So like the rest of this cabinet, the square portions are by far the easiest, and then it comes time for the angled cuts. So I'm just removing a little piece of wood that kind of stuck out on the front there to make these cuts a little easier. We're just checking to make sure that this square is the same distance. That was the basic gauge I had for this vertical, and once it was on there, I marked the underside. So coming up is probably what most people would consider a very dangerous cut. I'm going to be cutting these on my radial arm saw. You can see I could get most of the material out with it up against the fence, but then I'm going to pivot it to finish my curve cuts. Now the reason I chose to cut it this way was first off to get it very accurate. You could see on this one I don't have to pivot it, but also because my hand is far enough away from the blade that if it was to catch, it wouldn't pull my fingers into the blade, it would just catch on the wood. So I had that pivoted against the fence to make those angled cuts, and also I wasn't going fully through the wood, so curve cuts to me in general are already a little bit safer as it is. Now I couldn't completely cut through this one angle where the 2 meet on the inside face, so you will have to clean out a little bit of material with your chisel. So then this fits perfectly on there. I remark my verticals, and then same process. Since the radial arm saw, I kept it at the same depth. The depth I set for the circular saw is still the same, and I could just go through and cut all these curves. I do the 2 outer edges first because those are the ones that are the accurate measurement, and then the inside I just kind of Frankenstein cut them so they're thin enough to remove. You could see on that one hammer blow my inner frame kind of started to come apart a little bit. The brads held well, but not when there was a lot of stress on the joint. Then once again I could glue this together. So I did this in batches of 2. Those 2 outer edges are already set, and then I did the next 2 inner edges, and I let that set up. I believe I let this set up overnight just because, like I said, the frame is still kind of fragile with those brads, so I worked in sets of 2 so that it wouldn't pull apart. So then the last joints, once again, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because even though the angles on this are a little bit different, the process is the same. I could mark them and cut the curves on my saw, and you can see there's the pivot again with the radial arm saw, cutting this so that it makes a perfect line, and then cutting those inner pieces. Now this looks like a lot of work, and honestly when I decided to do lap joints on this I assumed it was going to be a lot of work, but it really wasn't that bad, and it's just going to give you a superior product at the end, something that's going to be very durable. So then I could just pop that in place and then clamp this as well. I don't know if I let this one set up overnight as well, but it's still warm enough that that Titebond sets up pretty quickly in my shop. Could remove all the clamps, and then I have to clean up these outer edges. I just used a handsaw to cut all these pieces off that are sticking out, and then I could use a hand plane to clean them up. So the cleanup on this isn't that bad because the underside you won't really see, and the top side's nice and flush. I just took an orbital sander and cleaned it up. So this is now upside down outside my shop, and I'm adding pieces to the bottom of the frame so that when you put the doors on top, there's something that will hold them. Now you don't need to do the entire perimeter like I did, but once you open the cabinet doors, it's just a nicer look to have this completely finished. I tacked these in place with brads, and when they set up, I went back through, which I did not film, and added screws to all of these pieces. You could see in the frame that there's a light pencil mark. That light pencil mark was after I had this frame completed. I brought it back to the house because it's only a block away from my shop. There's another view of that frame, and marked where the cabinet carcasses were, so I had a reference for how far my strips could go because I didn't want them to hit the underside of the frame. So to attach the doors, I'm going to be using piano hinges. I bought these and I believe they were 3-foot sections, I want to say. And I had to get 3 packages, and then I could cut them up easily with some aviator snips and a hacksaw, and get them to fit in there perfectly. The ones with the angles, you're going to have to trim the metal a little bit on the edges so that it will open and close. The same thing for the cabinet doors, just the way that the angles work. So then for the tops, I'm using plywood. Once again, I'm going to start with my squares because they're the easiest. So I'm just ripping down rough sizes of that 3/4 inch maple veneer ply. Once I had that, I put it on top because all of these are not perfectly square at this point. You go through on the underside and mark where I need to cut it to, and on my cross-cut sled, I could trim to my pencil mark, and then I could have a fairly nice fit. All of these I cut, rough cut, trim to size, and then to get an even reveal, I would mark once they were in place and then hand plane down little sections. So this is moving it into the shop, and you'll see I'll hand plane a little bit to get a nice fit. And the reveal on these, I don't know if I show it in camera, but it's pretty thick because I'm going to be adding edge banding to the edges of all of this. So I counted for that when I cut these. So then this is rough cutting for the angled pieces. Since I couldn't cut those on my cross-cut sled, I use my circular saw to follow my pencil marks on these ones. And this circular saw leaves a nice clean cut. Some of the battery powered ones and stuff that I've used before, since they're so light, you don't get as nice of a cut. Since these worm dried circular saws are so heavy, they just leave nice clean lines. You can see this is where I'm using the straight edge to mark where I want to plane down to. I'll hand plane down the edges, and once again I'll have nice clean fit in there without any undulations for that reveal. Even though cushions are going on top of this eventually, it's just a sign of markmanship to have nice reveals. So once I had all these cut, you could kind of see where I had to trim out the backside of those angled portions in order to get this to close. I just went through and I have a Vicks bit and one drill, and then it was really simple. I just laid them on the back like this, and then I put 2 screws in all of these to start, and then once they all fit nicely, I finished up and added the rest of the screws. You could see, super simple. These piano hinges, no mortising or anything like that. So once I had them all in place, this is adding all of the final screws. Then the edge banding, I didn't film a ton of this because it's just boring to do and boring to film, but this is just birch edge banding, and I have a edge banding iron for this, and I just attach it, trim it, and I did that to all the edges just so that it leaves a nice finished product. You could see the inner frame of that poplar on the bottom there, and then once that's set, I could attach this. Now I don't have any video of putting this in the space. I basically just walked it over there and slid it in place. Everything fit perfectly, and then I screwed it in the top. You could kind of see the spots where I puttied it because you're going to be putting it with cushions. You'd also see the 2 circle marks are going to have plastic grommets for the electrical going through, and I won't be painting this. The people on site are going to be painting it, which is awesome because I hate painting, but that also means I probably won't have finished videos of this piece.